You're listening to the Truflation.com podcast. Truflation.com is your definitive reference point for RWA, indexes, and inflation, backed by Coinbase and Chainlink, powering open, limitless markets.
It's just time to pay the price for not listening to advice and deciding in your youth on the policy of truth.
Today,
so Stefan, sorry. So let's cut to the chase. What is the number today, and does the government have it right or wrong in your opinion?
in our opinion, the government has it wrong, and the number right now that we have today is about 2%.
2%. And so in the way, in other words, we are at least the way you're measuring
Where the
it.
government wants us to be.
Yeah, you're at where the government wants us to be, and for whatever reason, because they're using trailing data, they're basically not getting it right, and also not using all of the data that you're using. So
they're reporting 3.5%. We don't think that's accurate. We think it's more in the 2.2%. If we look at it right now, today, and then tomorrow it'll deviate. There is volatility in the numbers, but because we're recording it every single day, but in essence, that's the difference. And we think the 2.2 is a much more accurate reflection of what prices have moved towards this year versus last year.
So Vinny,
can I ask a question? Sorry.
Well, go ahead. Ask your question first.
Stefan, hi. So are you able to track the deltas between your number and the government's number and actually predict what they're like the CPI print next week on the 15th? Can you predict what they're going to say based upon trading deltas?
So we spent a lot of effort trying to trade the deltas and work on predicting where they're going to come out at. We decided at the end of last year that they were changing the methodology a lot. They were constantly shifting around, that as of January or February this year, we found it really difficult when they changed the methodology again to be able to predict it in the future, that we just stopped doing that anymore. But in the past, we were doing that very accurately, and we were really within 0.1% deviation from where they were coming out on average over the course of the whole year, right? So we were pretty spot on for most of the time until they changed the methodology in February last year and then again in January this year. And it's always been a guess.
Yeah. So Vinny, you've been a little, you've expressed worry, I guess is the way I would put it, about where we're at, that, maybe inflation is higher than what people think, and we might even see rate hikes. Is that still your perspective? And where do you think the discrepancy, in all this might be in terms of the reality versus what people's understanding of reality is?
Yeah, so I think the issue really for me is I think these higher for longer rates are highly inflationary. I mean, about $1 billion it was $1 trillion in interest payments now per year going out of the system. And I think that what the Fed's seeing is raising rates has caused some of the inflation issues that we were seeing. My biggest concern, honestly, is the Fed balance sheet. And what they've just done now, like a week ago, is they dropped the taper from 60 down to 25, which is inflationary in and of itself, because what they're saying is we're going to cap how much rolls off the balance sheet. They're slowing down the pace. And and for those of you who don't understand how it really impacts the economy, basically, like, the Fed's balance sheet is somewhat of a liquidity pool, right? When the balance sheet gets bigger, they're injecting liquidity into the system, and the balance sheet goes down, they're taking liquidity out of the system. So now they're opting to reduce the rate at which they take the liquidity out of the system because of some concerns. It's I don't want to dominate the whole conversation because it's actually quite a long monologue in terms of where they're going, but the bottom line is I don't think we've seen the last of the inflation as measured by the government. And I get the Truflation number is very different because it's more of a living cost measure. Is that right, Stefan? I don't think it's how we perceive it as opposed to the monetary inflation that's happening.
And it's also historical, right? We just try to get as close to the historical numbers as we possibly can, and we only contrast year over year, right? What a lot of people seem to forget or neglect is the fact that the year before last year, we were up at close to 12%. So last year's number and this year's number is in aggregate, we're at 25%, but this year number is 2%. And like you, I 100% agree that prices are going to go up. We're seeing oil prices go up. Food costs are going up because of supply chain issues, weather issues, and you're seeing services go up, right? Wages have increased significantly in the services sector as well as across union workers, right? In old industries, we've put the wages up 6-10%, and so those are all going to have an impact in cost of living, and interest rates are likely to go up, or money print is already going. We've seen a global increase in money supply, so there's more money coming into the market. All the meanwhile, Western economies have not shown much GDP growth over the last 2 quarters.
So okay, let's try to make this maybe a little bit more short term, right? So Fred, you've made some comments. I noticed that you also believe that, and I want to put words in your mouth, but my interpretation is that inflation is kind of here to stay and or is also growing. Is that accurate, or how does that affect your overall thesis on how you're looking at investing? Can you lay that out for us?
Yeah. So I think my thesis is you have to look at Bitcoin and assets like gold as futures on long-term inflation, right? So I think you can get lost in sort of short-term movements, and I'll give you an example of that. I went to Argentina in 2015, and I hosted an event there at ICANN in 2015. I'm going to tell you, the general feeling in Argentina in 2015 in Buenos Aires was that inflation was now finally under control, right? Now, I don't need to tell you what's happened in Argentina over the last 9 years, right? It definitely was not out of control, and really you got to look at a longer term time frame. So if you look at the last 20 years and you go, okay, where has the price? How has U.S. dollars done versus gold? Well, U.S. dollars have depreciated 85%, versus gold in the last 20 years. So, there really is, this is over the next couple years, maybe inflation will be fine, and I agree with Truflation. Right now, I think we're going to probably have another couple of years that are going to look very benign, right? But I think the next 2 decades are going to look absolutely horrible. I think if you put your money in fiat and just put it in the bank at 5%, you're going to lose 90% of your purchasing power over the next 2 decades. You'll be down to 1/10 or even less of your purchasing power, and that's where I think Bitcoin is sensing that, and gold is sensing that.
So, Fred, I think you and I probably differ slightly on this. I don't think Bitcoin's value is a function of inflation. I think it's a function of global market liquidity, and this is fundamentally. If you look at 2022, for example, where liquidity was sucked out of the system, Bitcoin went into a bear cycle, and for multiple reasons, but the price went down, even though inflation was running really hot and high. And I think this is all about global liquidity, and we've seen this. If you just zoom out on Bitcoin over the past decade or so, the peaks of Bitcoin always coincides with high levels of dollar liquidity in the market. Well, and so not inflation per se, more liquidity.
Well, I completely disagree, but look, my view is this: Bitcoin was designed as a replacement to all the nightmares of fiat over the last, let's call it the last 50 years, but it goes even beyond that, right? And we're sort of seeing this debt printing that's just gone completely out of control, right? and it just took a huge delta up with the 2008 crisis with QE, right? And then we saw another sort of ratchet up with COVID, and I think right now it's very clear to me that this system won't last 20, 30 years from here. So I think Bitcoin is a new form of money. It's a new monetary standard. It's a new unit of account that can't be corrupted and that can be held in a self-sovereign account. So that's what I think Bitcoin is. And I think absolutely, the danger of all of this is inflation and money printing. But also the danger is just confiscation. It's banks telling you can't withdraw from the banks, all that. And Bitcoin is a solution to all that. And so,
Well, I disagree there as well. I had a big laugh because you probably following the Craig Wright trial. The judge froze all his worldwide assets, including his Bitcoin. He couldn't trade it. He couldn't sell it. He couldn't do shit with it. Like, whatever, irrelevant. But the point is, they were able to seize his Bitcoin by a worldwide freezing order. So Bitcoin is confiscatable. You can be frozen. Governments can basically sanction anybody, and you can't do shit with the Bitcoin except do illicit market trades. So it's not 100% true that Bitcoin is unconfiscatable.
But on the flip side, you do have, it's a rules-based process, right? The policy is rules-based, which is maintained by this decentralized network that has, and in a way, the rule is really, it's a tokenization of energy, really, or electricity, right? And the rule is locked in with, ultimately, you don't have a Federal Reserve that can then sit there in a private room and go and decide how much money to print and work together with the Federal Reserve to then decide on the amount that gets printed and what the interest rate should be in terms of the ability to justify that print. And so that is the unique element. The censorship resistance element has unfortunately lost a lot of its appeal due to all this regulatory and uncertainty, right, and biases.
So going back to what Fred was saying, because I'm trying to understand the nuance here of liquidity versus inflation, right? Because I think this is a really interesting concept. Fred, I think your point is that money printing will invariably lead to decades of inflation, and we're probably in a death spiral of some kind in that regard. But that in of itself, now just to play devil's advocate, and I'm obviously, I guess I'd call myself very long crypto as well, but that policy in and of itself doesn't guarantee demand, right? So isn't it in the short term, could you make the point that it's increases in liquidity that potentially create the demand in the short term because there is excess capital in the system that needs to go somewhere? Is that an important nuance, or does that not matter?
It is a nuance, but look, I would sort of say this: where excess liquidity goes into hard assets, right? It goes into various forms of hard assets, right? So, where's it gone in the past? Well, it went to stocks, right? Which it went to the top stocks. It went, it really benefited the S&P 500, right? Because all of a sudden the S&P 500 could borrow very easily, buy back their own shares, and the top 10, the magnificent 10, or the FANG, they have benefited tremendously from all this money printing. That's the first thing, okay? But it also went into real estate, not real estate as a sort of speculative, buying houses by the cartload, right? Just to plunk your money. And I think Larry Fink himself once said, the unit of value is now a condo in New York, right? So that's sort of his unit of value now. And so, and then Bitcoin is just, and gold was, somewhat discredited, but as many have observed, it's actually done really well over the last 20 years, right? So, and I personally bought a lot of gold in 2004 and 2003, okay? it has gone up 10x since I bought it, right? Almost 10x. You know, I bought it in the $200, like $300, and it's what, $280. Now it's up to $2,300. So, you know, gold, real estate, and stocks have all benefited tremendously. Now, you know, are they inflation? Well, they're a futures on inflation is what they are, right? So, you know, it's great to say, well, inflation's only 2%, but if you can't lock in a hedge on inflation, like buying a house or, you know, buying a long-term stock portfolio or buying Bitcoin, what good is it? You've only basically lasted, you know, however inflation is over the very short term. So I think that the key is, are you dealing with inflation 10 years out, 20 years out, or are you dealing with inflation over the next, you know, 2 quarters or the next 2 years? And I think everybody's focused on the next 2 years. And actually, the next 2 years doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what inflation is over the next 2 years. It doesn't matter whether it's 3%, 2%, 4%. I don't care. It doesn't matter. Because the reason I'm holding Bitcoin is not for the next 2 years. The reason I'm holding Bitcoin is for the next 10 or 20 years. I do not trust the fiat system over the next 10 or 20 years. It you said it's kind of a death spiral. It is a death spiral. It is a complete and utter death spiral. We are at, you know, 130% of GDP at the US. We're at 220% of debt to GDP in Japan. There is no way out of this. And you can keep on printing money like they're doing and spending, right, which they're doing. And yeah, as long as you completely spend and you don't cut down spending, it is inflationary, right? You're inflation. But cutting interest rates will also be inflationary. So the problem right now is we've gone into this endemic mode of nobody cares about the deficit at all, zero, right? And if you look at modern monetary theory by Stephanie Kelton, basically what she's saying is deficits are great. You should spend, you know, in fact, let's go spend $9 trillion. And I am not joking. This is part of the plan to spend $9 trillion on climate change. Okay. So, you know, if you think that is not going to be inflationary and that 9 trillion is not going to cut down on, you know, energy production and other things that we really need, right? I think you're deluding yourself, because we are headed into a vastly more inflationary world. That's kind of my view. And I commend Truflation. It's done a great job. I love the product. It is a great product. You know, we need an accurate way, because we cannot trust the government at all, right? They were completely wrong before the Fed, when the Fed said it was transitory. It wasn't transitory at all. The Fed is completely wrong. Their 500 PhDs cannot solve this problem at all. You know, they've got this, you know, system of 500 simultaneous equations, and literally it is like, you know, it reminds me of the medieval church, who had all these people studying, proving, you know, that the sun goes around the earth. And there was all these proofs of that, right? And all these learned people, you know, in the 1400s, and they basically imprisoned Galileo for, you know, daring to say that the earth is going around the sun. And, you know, look, we're in a situation where it's very much like Galileo here. It's like, you know, this system, the emperor has no clothes. This system is going to go bust. Okay. It will go bust in a very, very big way. And, you know, it is going to go bust in a Weimar Republic, Argentinian type way in the next 20 years. And I can tell you, I don't want to sound too alarmist, but that's my prediction. My prediction is the entire fiat system completely and utterly collapses in the next 20 years. And
yeah, hold on. So a couple of things, right? So I think long term, I would agree with you. And this is, you know, I'm speaking on behalf of Bill, not Aber here, but just to kind of make it a little bit more short term focused, right? So if I relate this to crypto, the crypto market cap, which is mostly Bitcoin, is up 125% since October, and peaked probably 150%. And has now been more or less trading in the same place, or is trading today at the same place it was about 10 weeks ago. So Vinny, in your opinion, are we in an accumulation phase where it's basically a cyclical bull market, or is something else happening vis-a-vis, your comments on liquidity versus inflation? Because I know you've, again, back to the earlier comment, you've expressed pretty significant concern about where we are with asset prices right now.
So if you look at when this current bull cycle started, right? It was normally the cycle starts after the halving. So you got to look at what was driving the cycle, and it was two things. One is obviously the Bitcoin ETF, but the other thing was that the market started forward looking 6 months as it does, and back in October, people were predicting 7 cuts for this year, and and the market started rallying across the board, in anticipation of those cuts. And we haven't seen any cuts. In fact, we're probably down to maybe 1 cut this year. And in fact, I think that's probably not going to happen personally. So the market's still looking for direction. Everyone believes that because it's a election year, we're going to see some cuts. And the hopium is strong. And the market's rallied on the back of that. But the moment the hope goes away that we're going to get cuts this year, the moment, and I look, you got to look at Jamie Dimon, right? He's one of the smartest bankers in the world. The guy's calling for 8% rates. And you have to ask yourself, why does Jamie Dimon put himself out there and say 8% is where it needs to go? And I actually quite agree with him. I think that if you look at the meme coins, you look at some of the dumb stuff that's happening out there, there is still too much liquidity, and the Fed is not shrinking their balance sheet fast enough to account for that. What they are doing is they are creating inflationary opportunities by reducing QT, which is effectively a stealth QE. And I think, and I don't know for certain, I think they've either offered or they've already given the Bank of Japan some sort of swap line to help them balance out their currency problems right now, because Japan's actively buying yen, selling dollars, and it doesn't seem to be that they're reducing the bonds that they're holding, in the same proportion. So something funny is going on there, I think, and they obviously met 2 or 3 weeks ago. Because Yellen, he has to keep financing these crazy deficits of 7% by selling bonds, and I think they're doing the 10-year, the 20-year or 30-year today as well. And listen, everything they're doing is very inflationary. I don't see how inflation comes down, and I think that the one thing I can tell you about the Fed is you can always rely on them to make the wrong decision at the right time, and they continue to do that. And so you can expect inflation to come roaring back if the CPI print next week is in line with the 3.5 they're projecting. That's fine. But I don't think we're going to see. I think we'll see 4% before we see 3%, and I don't think we're going to see any cuts this year. And I think we see a hike before we see a cut. And the moment the market wakes up and realizes that the reprieve isn't coming, liquidity is going to be sucked out of the system again, because everyone's positioning for cuts.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments on that, and I'd like to get Stefan's take on this as well. But so first of all, if I put my kind of little skeptical hat on regarding Jamie Dimon's comment, I mean, given that he's basically in Elizabeth Warren's camp and would be fine for the socialization of the banks where he's the only bank, it seems like 8% interest rates, which would kill half the mid-sized banks in this country who basically are holding long-term dated bonds, would be massively insolvent, right? So
hold on, Bo. Just hold that thought for a second. So why would it kill them? Let's just go through
because the Fed made them buy their dog shit debt at 0% interest rates,
right?
And basically are allowing them to
so they fucked up
at 30-year 30-year prices as opposed to short-term prices, and raising interest rates to 8%, if there was any kind of run on the banks, would kill everyone but his bank, and the ultimate form of regulatory capture.
Right. And why is that so unbelievable? So
it's not unbelievable.
So let's just go through how we got ourselves in this situation. Okay, the Fed changed the rules that allowed you to market shit that's gone down in price. So basically, the Fed's done a combination of two things. They impaired their own balance sheet when they raised rates and to fight inflation. They also impaired the balance sheets of hundreds of thousands of banks. With trillions of dollars worth of bonds, but those banks don't have to report those markdowns if it's hold to maturity. And then they launched the bank term funding program in response to what happened last year with FRB and Silvergate and SVB, etc. And that's just expired now. So the banks are all sitting on balance sheets that are highly impaired but not being reported as such. And so something is going to break. And the bottom line is, it is probably going to break because inflation is not going to go away, and the Fed doesn't have a choice but to use the tools at its disposal. Now, the Fed's going to do two. I think they're going to do two things. I think they're going to basically raise rates in the short term, but then try to do some sort of QE on the back end to inject liquidity into the banking system so the collapse doesn't happen. So
Okay,
they think. So they think.
This is what I wanted.
So they think, but it's going to backfire.
So this is what I wanted to ask Stefan. So I actually think that everybody's focused on interest rates, and I don't think that's necessarily the right way to look at this, because I think that the Fed has a lot of tools, and I'm going to refer to them as backhanded ways to inject liquidity into the system, simply because the public doesn't understand. They just focus on interest rates as a lever and as the ultimate lever. And it used to be historically that you could look at oil prices and interest rates, and you can more or less guess which direction the economy was moving in. So Stefan, when you guys look at this, do you have a guess or an opinion as to how and whether the Fed will use other means to inject liquidity into the system now, and what that might mean for asset prices and crypto in the short term?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I tend to agree with I think everybody's statement here, right? At some point, and it's not only the banks' balance sheet that are getting abused in a way, it's other countries, right? It's whole other nations that have a bucket load of debt in US dollars. And by the way, it's not just the US, and the US is best off because it's the most transparent compared to any other